The air in the grand hall felt thick, a warm mixture of perfume, cologne, and the low, steady hum of 100 conversations happening at once. It was the kind of place where laughter was polite and smiles were carefully crafted, each person a small part of a larger, gleaming picture. Tables draped in white linen were dotted with wine glasses that caught the light, throwing tiny dancing stars onto the walls. This was the annual fundraising gala, an evening dedicated to saving the town's one and only art school from closing its doors for good. Hope was a fragile thing, and tonight it was dressed in its best and looking for donations. At the front of the room, on a raised platform that felt almost like an altar, sat the reason for the evening's steep ticket price. It wasn't a speaker or a celebrity. It was a piano. A magnificent ebony grand, its polished surface so deep and dark it seemed to drink the light around it. A single spotlight from the ceiling bathed it in a soft golden glow, making every curve and line look like it had been sculpted by an artist's own hand. For the students and teachers of the struggling school, this piano was a symbol. It was a promise that beauty could still find a place in a world that often seemed to forget it. Later in the evening, a man with a famous name was scheduled to sit on its velvet bench and pull music from its strings. A performance that was meant to open hearts and, more importantly, checkbooks. Amidst the clinking of silverware and the rustle of expensive dresses, one person was almost completely still. She was an old nun, her frame small and slight beneath the traditional dark habit and white wimple that framed her face. Her hands, spotted with age and mapped with the blue rivers of old veins, rested folded in her lap. Unlike the others, she wasn't engaged in the art of networking. She wasn't sipping the expensive wine or laughing at a patron's joke. She was watching the piano. She watched it with an intensity that was out of place, a quiet, unwavering focus that made the bustling room around her feel like a distant, blurry photograph at her. The rest of the gala was just background noise. The man in the crisp tuxedo talking too loudly about his stock portfolio. The woman with the diamond necklace laughing at a story that wasn't that funny. These were just sounds like wind or rain. Her entire world had shrunk to the space between her chair and that stage. She could feel a pull, a strange and powerful current flowing from the silent instrument, calling to a part of her that had been dormant for a very long time. It wasn't just admiration. It was recognition. She knew that piano. Not this specific one, of course, but the soul of it. She knew its potential, the stories it could tell, the tears it could coax, the joy it could unleash. Her gaze traced the elegant curve of the piano's lid, imagining it lifted to reveal the strings and hammers inside, the intricate machinery of a miracle. She remembered the smell of wood polish and the unique, dusty scent of old music books. She remembered the feel of a key under her finger, the cool, smooth surface of the ivory giving way to the firm, responsive pressure beneath. A memory, so faint, it was almost a ghost. Flickered behind her eyes, the sensation of a chord vibrating through the wooden floorboards and up into her bones. It was a feeling of being connected to something much larger than herself. A river of sound that she could navigate and command. Her fingers, usually so still in prayer or work, gave a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in her lap. They remembered things her conscious mind had tried to let go of. They remembered the dance of scales, the complex patterns of fugues, the thundering power of a fortissimo run that could make your heart feel like it was beating in time with the music. A lifetime ago, her hands had been her voice. Now they were just hands used for gardening and for folding laundry, for offering comfort to the sick and for writing letters to distant family. The music had been sealed away, a choice she had made with a clear and peaceful heart. But seeing the piano now, alone and waiting in the spotlight, felt like seeing a ghost from a past she had loved deeply. She had come to the gala at the invitation of a young woman who had once been a student in her catechism class. The girl, now a young adult, was a graduate of this very art school and had spoken so passionately about the program that the nun had felt she had to support it. The young woman, full of bright energy, had quickly been swept into the crowd, leaving the old nun to find a quiet corner to observe. She was happy to be there, happy to help, even if all she could offer was her silent presence. But she had not expected this. She had not expected to walk into a room and find her entire history sitting on a stage, bathed in light, a few tables away. A man in a perfectly pressed suit was pacing a small, nervous track. His name was not important to anyone but himself, but his role was. He was the organizer, the man responsible for every detail of the evening. He held a clipboard, like it was a shield, and his eyes were constantly scanning the room. His expression a mixture of pride and intense anxiety. To him, the piano was not a symbol of beauty. It was a very expensive, very fragile asset. It was the main event. He saw it as a line item on his schedule, a crucial part of the evening's program that had to be executed perfectly. His gaze flickered over the old nun, lingering for just a second. He saw her as no one of consequence, just another guest, part of the backdrop. He had no way of knowing the storm of memory she held in her quiet stillness, or the connection she felt to the object he was tasked with protecting. The speeches were ending. The clapping died down. A host on stage announced a brief intermission before the main musical performance. People began to stir, rising from their seats to stretch their legs, to visit the bar, or to mingle with new acquaintances. The organized rows of guests began to dissolve into a shifting crowd. And in that moment of change, as a space opened up between the tables and the stage, the old nun felt the pull become irresistible. It was now or never. She just wanted to touch it. Not to play it, not to draw any attention to herself. She just wanted to feel the coolness of the keys under her fingertips one last time. A silent hello to an old friend she had never forgotten. With a breath that felt both heavy and light, she placed her hands on the arms of her chair and began, very slowly, to stand. Her legs felt a little stiff as she rose, the joints protesting after sitting for so long. It was the familiar ache of age, a quiet reminder that the body she inhabited now was not the same one she had known as a girl. She ignored it. Her focus was singular, a pinprick of light in the crowded, noisy room. The path to the stage was surprisingly clear. People were busy, lost in their own small worlds, their conversations creating a wall of sound that somehow made her feel invisible. This was good. She wasn't seeking attention. She was seeking a moment of quiet communion. She moved slowly, her steps deliberate and careful on the polished floor. The soft soles of her worn shoes made no sound, a stark contrast to the sharp clicking heels of the other women in the room. She weaved between a couple locked in an intense, whispered conversation and a group of men laughing loudly at a shared joke. She didn't see their faces. She only saw the path ahead, a widening ribbon of empty space that led directly to the steps of the stage. The spotlight on the piano seemed to grow brighter as she got closer, drawing her in like a moth to a flame. Though this was a flame of memory, not of destruction. She reached the edge of the stage, was higher than it looked from her chair, 3 simple wooden steps leading up to the polished platform. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Was this right? Was it an intrusion? But the piano was so close, singing its silent siren song. Her longing was a physical thing, a gentle pressure in her chest that pushed her onward. She placed a hand on the handrail, the wood cool and solid beneath her touch, and carefully climbed the first step, then the second, then the third. The world seemed to fall away behind her. The hum of the crowd softened to a distant murmur. The clinking of glasses became a forgotten rhythm. She was on the stage now, in the sacred space reserved for performers. She stood beside the piano for a long moment, just looking at it. From up here, she could see everything. The flawless black finish, the intricate gold lettering of the maker's name on the side, the way the spotlight made the white keys look like they were glowing from within. It was even more beautiful up close. It was perfect. And she felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude to the person who had donated such a treasure to this small, struggling school. It was an act of faith, a belief in the power of art that she understood in the deepest part of her soul. Slowly, as if moving through water, she extended her right hand. Her fingers, crooked with arthritis and years of hard work, trembled slightly. It wasn't from fear, but from anticipation. They were remembering their purpose. The air between her hand and the keys seemed to thicken, to crackle with a silent energy. She wasn't going to play. She knew her limits. Her fingers were not what they once were, and the memory of her skill was sharper than the reality of it would ever be. This was not a performance. This was a prayer. Simple, physical act of remembrance. Her fingertips were now just inches away from the ivory, so close she could almost feel the coolness radiating from them. She was about to bridge the gap, to touch that long-lost part of herself, when a voice cut through the silence around her. "Excuse me, sister." The voice was sharp, but not unkind. It was the voice of someone who is busy and trying to be polite about it. The sound was like a splash of cold water, instantly breaking the spell she was under. Her hand froze, hovering over the keys. She blinked, the golden glow of the spotlight and the haze of memory receding, and the reality of the gala came rushing back into focus. She turned her head slowly, her heart giving a little flutter of surprise. Standing at the foot of the stage was the man with the clipboard. Up close, he looked even more stressed. His brow was furrowed, his tie was slightly loosened, and his eyes held a look of frantic impatience that he was clearly trying to mask. He was the organizer, the one who had been pacing like a caged animal earlier. He had his hands held up in a gentle but firm gesture of stop. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice a little breathless, as if he had jogged over. "I truly am. But I can't let anyone touch the instrument." The old nun felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. Of course, it was a foolish thing to do, really. It's an old woman climbing up on a stage like a child drawn to a toy. She looked from the man's stern face back to the piano, and for a second, the beauty of it was tainted by the feeling of being caught doing something wrong. She let her hand fall to her side, the connection she was about to make severed before it began. "It's the performer," the man continued, explaining himself with a nervous sort of energy. "The guest pianist is very, very particular about his instruments. It's in his contract. No one is to touch it before he does. There's no tuning, no dusting, no anything. I'm responsible, you see. I'd be in a world of trouble if he found a fingerprint." He forced a tight smile, trying to soften the rejection. "I hope you understand. It's nothing personal, of course." A few nearby guests had noticed the interaction. A woman in a sparkling blue dress nudged her companion and whispered something behind her hand. A man with a graying beard watched with a look of mild curiosity. The old nun felt very small and very old. She was an object of pity, an old fool who had overstepped. The warmth she had felt just moments ago turned to a cold knot in her stomach. All the beautiful memories the piano had stirred up now felt like a foolish indulgence. I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice quiet and shaky. "I didn't mean any harm. It's a beautiful piano." The man nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. He could see she was not a vandal, just a harmless old woman who got a little carried away. "It is, isn't it?" he agreed, his tone shifting from authoritative to a bit more weary. "The best. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to make sure the caterer is refilling the champagne. Please, be careful coming down the steps." The curt nod. He turned and briskly walked away, his mind already on the next crisis. He was gone as quickly as he had appeared, leaving her alone on the stage, feeling utterly deflated. The magic was broken. The piano was just a piano again, and she was just a guest who had broken the rules. She could feel the eyes of the few onlookers on her back. She didn't want to turn and see their faces. Humiliation washed over her in a hot wave. She had only wanted a small, private moment. Instead, she had made a small, public spectacle of herself. With a heavy heart, she turned away from the piano. It was painful to look at it now. It was no longer a beloved old friend, but a forbidden object, a thing that had rejected her. She carefully made her way down the 3 steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. Her feet, which had moved so silently on the way up, now seemed to shuffle loudly on the floor. Every rustle of a dress, every clink of a spoon against a glass, seemed to be magnified, pointing her out as someone who didn't belong. She walked back to her empty seat, her head bowed. The chair felt different now, less like a haven and more like a cage. She folded her hands back in her lap, but this time they felt clumsy and useless. They were the hands of an old woman who had forgotten her place. She kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, tracing the patterns with her gaze, too ashamed to look up. The urge to cry was strong, a sting behind her eyes, but she fought it down. She had made a mistake. It was a silly, sentimental mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. She would just sit here, quietly, and try to disappear. We would watch the famous pianist play his beautiful music, and she would be happy for the school. And she would try to ignore the ache in her heart, the longing that had been given a glimpse of freedom, only to be snatched away. The gala, which had seemed so full of magic just a few minutes ago, now felt like just another room in a long life, and she felt very, very alone. The old nun sat perfectly still, a small, dark island in a sea of light and chatter. The sting of embarrassment was still fresh, a hot feeling on her skin. She kept her gaze lowered, focusing on a small water stain on the white tablecloth that looked a bit like a bird in flight. It was easier to look at the stain than to risk catching someone's eye. She replayed the organizer's words in her mind, the sharp, practical tone of them. The guest pianist is very, very particular. Of course he was. A man of his stature, with his famous name, would have rules. She was the one who was out of place, a relic from a different time, a trespasser in his world. She took a quiet, steadying breath and tried to let the feeling go. It was a small moment, a silly impulse, and it was over. She told herself to be grateful for the life she had chosen, for the quiet purpose of her days. The piano was a beautiful memory, and that was all it needed to be. Around her, the evening was starting to drift toward its climax. The host, a man with a voice that was too loud and a smile that was too wide, had taken the stage again. He was introducing the main event, talking about the pianist's long and decorated career. He spoke of sold-out concert halls in cities she had only read about, of awards and critical praise. The old nun listened, but the words felt distant, like they were describing a different planet. She didn't resent the man his success. She simply felt a world away from it. The life she had lived was measured not in applause, but in the quiet satisfaction of a task well done, in the peaceful rhythm of a community centered on faith. And now, the host boomed, his voice swelling with dramatic importance. The moment you have all been waiting for. Please put your hands together for the incredible, the one and only Mr. Alistair Finch. The room erupted in polite, enthusiastic applause. The organizer, the man with the clipboard, stood near the side of the stage, looking visibly relieved. This was it, the highlight of the evening, the part that was supposed to inspire generosity. A young man in a neat suit scurried over from the side of the room, his face tense. He leaned in close to the organizer, whispering something urgently. The old nun watched from her corner, a flicker of curiosity cutting through her self-pity. She saw the organizer's face change. The relief that had been there moments before evaporated, replaced by a look of confusion. Then dawning horror, the organizer held up a hand to the young man. A gesture that said wait, and then listened more. His brow furrowing so deeply it looked like it might be permanently etched onto his forehead. He kept glancing toward the entrance of the hall, as if expecting someone to appear. The applause began to falter as the audience noticed the empty stage. The host, still smiling his too wide smile, started to improvise. Ah, it seems Mr. Finch is making his grand entrance. Let's give him another moment, a truly warm welcome for the master. The applause started up again, a little weaker this time, more confused. The old nun could feel the mood in the room shift. The confident, cheerful buzz was being replaced by a low, uneasy murmur. The young assistant was still talking, his hands moving frantically as he explained the situation. The organizer ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, completely messing it up. He looked like a man who was watching a dam crack. He shook his head, a sharp, angry gesture, and then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He mouthed a curse word that the old nun could read from across the room. Something was terribly wrong. The organizer finally made a decision. He marched quickly onto the stage, pulling the host aside. The two of them huddled together for a moment, their backs to the audience. Their whispered conversation lost in the growing noise of the crowd. The host's smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of genuine concern. The old nun could see the panic in the organizer's eyes. A wild, frantic look that no amount of clipboard checking could fix. Finally, the host turned back to the microphone. He took a deep breath, trying to summon the professional calm he was known for, but it wouldn't come. His voice, when he spoke, was tight with strain. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement. It seems we are experiencing a slight change in our program." He paused, searching for the right words, the diplomatic way to say that the entire evening was falling apart. "I am very sorry to inform you that Mr. Finch has taken ill. A sudden and severe fever, we are told. He is, of course, unable to perform tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. It was followed by a wave of disappointed murmurs that grew louder, more restless. This was not just a minor inconvenience. The main act, the whole point of the gala, for many, was gone. The organizer stood on the edge of the stage, looking pale and sweaty. He was a man who prided himself on control, and he had just lost all of it. He could see the evening's goal desperately needed funds for the school dissolving before his eyes. A disappointed crowd was not a generous crowd. "We will, of course, be refunding the portion of your tickets that corresponds to the performance," the host continued, his voice barely audible over the rising tide of chatter. "In the meantime, please, enjoy the rest of the evening. The bar will remain open." It was a disaster. The carefully constructed atmosphere of elegance and hope was collapsing into chaos. People started to get up from their tables, not to mingle, but to leave. The host, his job done for the moment, hurried off the stage, leaving the organizer to face the music, or rather, the complete lack of it. The grand piano sat on stage, bathed in its spotlight, looking more magnificent and more tragic than ever. It was now a monument to failure, a beautiful, silent symbol of the evening's ruin. The organizer stood there, a man alone on a sinking ship. He had backup plans for everything: extra champagne, a vegetarian option for the caterer, a spare microphone, but he had no backup for Alistair Finch. He started walking through the room, trying to placate people, offering apologies that were met with shrugs and disappointed frowns. He felt like a failure. The school, the children, the teachers who worked so hard, they were all counting on this night. And he had let them down. He was so caught up in his own frantic thoughts that he almost bumped into someone. It was the Mother Superior from the local convent, the woman who had brought the old nun. She was a tall, stately woman with a calm presence that seemed to cut through the noise. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. The organizer looked at her, his face a mask of desperation. "I couldn't help but overhear. You are in need of a pianist?" The organizer let out a short, humorless laugh. "Desperately. Do you happen to know one who can play in the next 5 minutes and isn't on death's door?" He immediately regretted his sarcastic tone. "I'm sorry. I'm just a bit stressed." Mother Superior didn't seem to notice his rudeness. Her gaze drifted across the room to the corner where the old nun sat, staring at her tablecloth. "I might," she said softly. "Sister Agnes, in our community, was quite accomplished in her youth. Very accomplished." The organizer followed her gaze. He saw the old, frail woman he had stopped from touching the piano just minutes before. The memory of it made him wince. He looked back at the Mother Superior, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pure desperation. "The nun? You're joking." "I do not joke about these things," the Mother Superior said calmly. "She has not played for an audience in many, many years. But the gift is something one does not simply lose. It is a part of the soul." The organizer was desperate. The room was emptying out. He could already hear the phone calls he would have to make tomorrow, the apologies he would have to give. What did he have to lose? A moment of terrible embarrassment? He was already living it. He looked at the old nun again. She seemed so harmless, so lost, but the Mother Superior's words stuck with him, a part of the soul. He looked at the empty stage, at the silent, waiting piano. It was a crazy idea. It was a terrible, insane, last-ditch idea. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Ask her." It was the most reckless thing he had ever done in his organized, careful life. But in that moment of total chaos, it felt like the only move left to make. He watched as the Mother Superior glided gracefully across the room, toward the old, forgotten nun. A flicker of the most impossible hope sparking in the organizer's weary heart. The organizer watched from a distance, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw the Mother Superior lean over the old nun, her lips moving in a quiet, earnest conversation. He saw the nun's head shake, a small, defeated gesture. She was refusing. Of course, she was refusing. Why would she want to put herself on display after the humiliation he had caused her? He had made her feel small and foolish. Now he was asking her for a miracle. The bitterness of his own desperation soured in his mouth. He had made a terrible mess of everything, and now he was bothering this poor gentlewoman with his impossible problems. He should just go on stage, tell everyone to go home, and face the consequences. But the Mother Superior didn't give up. She placed a hand on the nun's shoulder, a gesture of such simple, unwavering support that, even from across the room, the organizer could feel its strength. She wasn't pleading. She was affirming. The organizer couldn't hear the words, but he could see their effect. The old nun's shoulders, which had been slumped in shame, seemed to straighten just a little. She looked up at the Mother Superior, her eyes full of doubt, but also something else, a tiny spark of a long-forgotten fire. The Mother Superior nodded once, a slow, certain nod, and then she simply waited. The old nun's sister, Agnes. He remembered the name, looked out at the room, at the faces of the disappointed guests. At the empty stage where Glory was supposed to be, her eyes drifted to the piano, still waiting in its pool of light. The organizer saw a war being fought behind her eyes. The fear of embarrassment versus the memory of love. The desire to stay hidden versus the call to serve. It was a battle that lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of confidence, but of surrender. She had agreed. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over the organizer. It was a crazy idea, a desperate gamble, but it was a chance. He watched as the Mother Superior helped the old nun to her feet. This time her journey to the stage was not a secret, private pilgrimage. It was a public walk. The low murmur of the crowd began to change as people noticed what was happening. Whispers flew from table to table. Is that? What's she doing? There must be some mistake. A few people let out soft, derisive laughs. Others just stared with open, cynical curiosity. A man who had been putting on his coat to leave paused, his arm halfway through his sleeve, his brow furrowed in confusion. Sister Agnes felt every single gaze. They felt like tiny, sharp needles on her skin. She could feel their disbelief, their pity, and their scorn. Her legs felt like they were made of lead. Each step was a monumental effort. She was not a musician. She was a spectacle. A last-minute, pathetic attempt to salvage a sinking ship. She kept her eyes fixed on the stage, on the 3 wooden steps that had felt so inviting before and now felt like a walk to the gallows. The Mother Superior let her go at the foot of the stage, giving her a final, encouraging nod that she didn't see. She climbed the steps slowly, the entire room watching. The silence was absolute now, thick and heavy. The host, who had retreated to the side of the stage, looked on with a pained expression, as if he couldn't bear to watch. The organizer held his breath. Sister Agnes reached the piano bench. It seemed higher than she remembered. She lowered herself onto it, her body feeling stiff and awkward. Her feet, in their plain, practical shoes, barely brushed the pedals. She was too short, too old, too frail. For a horrifying moment, she thought she wouldn't even be able to reach. The audience was waiting. The silence was crushing. This was a mistake. Then she placed her hands on the keys. It was different this time. The touch was not a forbidden secret, but a public declaration. The ivory felt cool and firm and utterly beautifully familiar. The moment her fingers settled into their natural curved shape, a change began. It started in her hands, a warmth spreading up her arms like a thawing river. It traveled to her spine, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her stooped, arthritic back began to straighten. The frail, elderly woman seemed to grow, to expand, filling the space around her. Her head lifted. Her eyes, which had been darting around in fear, slowly closed. She was no longer in the room. She wasn't Sister Agnes, the shy, humiliated nun. She was gone. In her place was a musician, her fingers pressed down, and the first notes filled the silent hall. They were not hesitant or unsure. They were clear, resonant, and full of a quiet, heartbreaking sadness. It was a simple melody, but it was so pure, so full of longing that it felt like it was being pulled directly from her soul. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a single, perfect thread of gold. Then, the music began to grow. It was like a story being told without words. The simple melody tangled with another and another, weaving together into a tapestry of sound that was so intricate and complex it was breathtaking. It was Chopin, a nocturne, but no one in the room was thinking about composers. They were only feeling. A torrent of sound poured from the piano. The quiet sorrow deepened into a profound grief, a storm of weeping chords that thundered through the hall. People who had been laughing just moments ago now sat with tears streaming silently down their faces. A cynical-looking woman in the front row clutched her husband's arm, her expression one of pure, unguarded shock. The organizer stood rooted to the spot, his clipboard forgotten on the floor. The music was pulling him apart and putting him back together again. He felt the stress of the evening, the fear of failure, the petty anxieties, all being washed away by the flood of sound. This was not a performance. This was an exorcism. The old nun was pouring every ounce of her life, every unspoken joy, and every hidden pain into the music. Her fingers, which had looked so gnarled and weak just minutes before, were flying across the keys with a strength and a speed that seemed impossible. They were no longer the hands of an old woman. They were instruments of pure will, dancing and leaping and striking with a fierce, untamed passion. The music swelled to a crescendo, a thundering, the roaring wave of emotion that filled every corner of the hall, shaking the very floorboards. It was the sound of a life lived to the fullest, of a love so deep it could never be fully expressed. And then, as suddenly as it had begun to rage, it softened. The storm passed. The music became gentle again, a soft, tender melody that felt like forgiveness, like a quiet peace after a long, hard struggle. It was the sound of a final, beautiful surrender, and with one last perfectly placed chord that seemed to hold all the sorrow and all the beauty of the world. The music stopped. The final note faded, but its echo remained, hanging in the air like a ghost. And in the space where the sound had been, there was a silence. It wasn't the empty silence of before, or the uncomfortable silence of a mistake. It was a full, heavy, sacred silence. No one moved. No one spoke. No one even breathed. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid to break the spell. For 10 long, heart-stopping seconds, the world was completely and utterly still, held captive by the magic of what they had just witnessed. The silence that followed the last note was a living thing. It filled the grand hall, pressing in on every person, holding them captive in a moment of shared awe. For 10 long seconds, the world seemed to stop turning. No one dared to breathe, let alone speak or move. They were all still caught in the wake of the sound, the echoes of the music reverberating not in their ears, but deep within their chests. It was a silence that was more profound than any noise, quiet that was thick with unshed tears and unspoken understanding. Then, a sound broke the spell. It was a single person clapping, a harsh, desperate sound at first, as if they couldn't hold it in any longer. It was the young woman, the former student who had invited the nun, her face wet with tears. Her hands were moving so fast, they were a blur. That solitary act was a spark in a room full of dry tinder. Instantly, the entire room erupted. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause from the beginning of the evening. This was an explosion. It was a wave of sound that started at the front and crashed over the entire hall, a roar of pure, unfiltered emotion. People were on their feet, every single one of them, their bodies driven by an instinct they couldn't control. They were not just applauding. They were cheering, shouting, bravo, and brava. At the small, still figure on the stage, the sound was overwhelming, physical force that shook the walls and vibrated through the floor. The organizer stood in the middle of it all, his clipboard lying forgotten on the ground. He was clapping so hard his palms stung, his own vision blurred by tears he didn't even realize were falling. He looked around at the faces of the guests and saw not polite society patrons, but human beings who had been completely and utterly transformed. The cynical woman was sobbing openly into her hands. The man who had been putting on his coat was now standing on his chair, whistling and applauding like a madman. This was not the reaction to a performance. This was a catharsis. The despair of a failed evening had been washed away, replaced by a joy so intense it was almost painful. On the stage, the sound seemed to take a moment to reach the nun. She had been somewhere else entirely, lost in the world she had created with her own two hands. As the last note faded, her eyes fluttered open slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep. She blinked once, twice, and the grand hall came back into focus. The roar of the crowd hit her all at once. A deep, fiery blush spread across her face, turning her pale skin a bright, embarrassed crimson. She looked at the hundreds of people on their feet, shouting for her, and a look of complete and utter bewilderment crossed her features. She didn't see a grateful audience. She saw a room full of people staring at her. The shy, private part of her, the part she had lived in for 50 years, came rushing back in a flood of panic. She instinctively shrank, her shoulders curling inward again. She gave a tiny, awkward curtsy from her seat on the bench. A gesture that was so out of place and so humble that it only made the crowd cheer louder. They weren't cheering for a polished performer. They were cheering for the miracle of a hidden soul laid bare. She couldn't stand it for another second. She rose quickly from the bench, her movements clumsy and rushed now, and practically fled the stage, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't want to see their faces, didn't want to be the object of their adoration. She had given them the music, and in her mind, the transaction was over. As she hurried down the steps, the Mother Superior was there to meet her, enveloping her in a warm, protective embrace, shielding her from the piercing lights and the intense gaze of the crowd as the old nun was led away. The energy in the room began to shift. The roar of applause softened into a hum of excited, emotional chatter. People were turning to each other, their faces still wet, their voices raised in wonder. Who is she? Where did she learn to play like that? That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my entire life. The organizer moved through the room, his steps light and his heart full. People were grabbing his arm, pulling him close, their eyes shining. That was incredible, a man in a tuxedo said, his voice thick with emotion. Forget the famous pianist. That was the real thing. Tell us about her. Another woman pleaded. We have to know her story. The organizer, who had been feeling like a failure just moments ago, now felt like the custodian of an incredible secret. He found himself at the center of the gathering and the story. As the Mother Superior quietly shared it with him, began to unfold, her name was Mary Onsworth, not Agnes. Agnes was the name she took when she joined the convent. Before that, she was just Mary, and Mary was no amateur. She was, the Mother Superior explained, a child prodigy. The youngest person ever to be admitted to the most famous music school in the country, a place that only accepted a handful of the most gifted students in the world. By the age of 15, her name was being whispered in the highest circles of classical music. Critics who heard her play spoke of her with the same reverence they reserved for the legends. She was on a path that was destined for concert halls in Vienna, for Paris, for the entire world. But Mary had another calling. She had a deep, quiet faith that was just as powerful as her musical talent. As she grew older, the world of fame and competition began to feel hollow to her. She loved the music, but she hated the performance. She felt the most profound joy not in the applause, but in the practice, in the silent, solitary hours of creating something beautiful. She felt a pull toward a life of service, a life of quiet contemplation and giving. So, at the age of 21, at the very brink of international stardom, she did the unthinkable. She walked away. She gave up her career, her fame, her future as a public figure, and entered a closed order, dedicating her life to God. For 50 years, her gift had been a secret, a private treasure she shared only with herself in the quiet of the chapel. She had played for morning mass for the sisters for the pure joy of it. She had never once missed the spotlight, never once regretted her choice. She had found a different kind of music in the rhythm of a life dedicated to others. As the organizer shared this story with the rapt audience, a new kind of silence fell over the room. This silence was not one of awe, but of profound respect. The woman they had just seen, the timid old nun who had fled from their applause, was not just a talented amateur. She was a ghost from the world's greatest stages, a legend who had chosen a different path. Every note they had heard was suddenly imbued with the weight of that choice. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was a sacrifice. That night, the art school didn't just meet its fundraising goal. It shattered it. The checks were written with a sense of joy and gratitude that no amount of fancy catering or celebrity performers could have ever inspired. People didn't feel like they had donated. They felt like they had received a gift. When the organizer found the old nun later, she was sitting in a quiet corner, her hands folded in her lap, looking drained but peaceful. He approached her cautiously, not wanting to intrude. "Sister," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you. You saved us tonight." Looked up at him, her eyes clear and calm. "I only did what you asked," she said simply. "It is a wonderful school. It deserves to be saved." No, the organizer insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "You did so much more than that. You reminded everyone in that room what it means to be truly gifted. Not for fame or for money, but just for the love of the beauty itself." The old nun offered a small, gentle smile. She didn't see herself as a hero or a legend. She was just a woman who had answered a call. "The music," she said softly, "is not ours to keep. We are only meant to let it pass through us." And in that moment, looking at the humble woman who had held an entire room in the palm of her hand, he understood. The awe they all felt wasn't just for the incredible performance they had witnessed. It was for the beautiful, inspiring, and humbling truth that the most magnificent stories are sometimes hidden in the quietest of people, waiting for a single moment of need to remind the world of their magic.